All right, so they've started the journey to Rome. Against Paul's strong recommendations not to start the journey yet, they have chosen to go ahead and begin. The commander, centurion, whatever you want to call him, chose to listen to the sailors rather than listen to Paul, which, under the circumstances would have probably made sense. You would listen to a seasoned sailor more often than you listen to someone who was not. But the Apostle Paul had warned it's not going to be easy, it's going to be dangerous, or possibly going to be loss of life and cargo. And sure enough, as soon as they begin, storms begin to arise. It's very difficult as they're trying to make their way to at least someplace safe now that where they can winter. They're hoping to get to Phoenix, a harbor of Crete, as we saw last week, and winter there. And so today we pick up with Acts 27, verse 13. When the south wind blew softly, supposing that they had obtained their desire, putting out to sea, they sailed close by Crete. But not long after, a tempestuous headwind arose, called Euroclydon. So when the ship was caught and could not head into the wind, we let her drive. And running under the shelter of an island called Clauda, we secured the skiff with difficulty. When they had taken it on board, they used cables to undergird the ship, and fearing lest they should run aground on the Syrtis sands, they struck sail and so were driven. And because we were exceedingly tempest-tossed, the next day they lightened the ship. On the third day, we threw the ship's tackle overboard with our own hands. And let's just pause there for a few moments. Okay. So, they got what they thought was the ideal conditions to begin, finishing their journey to Phoenix, the harbor where they wanted to winter. And the goal is they are going to hug the island of Crete as they go, stay as close to it as possible, and kind of make their way around it. But all of a sudden, they've got this gale force storm that suddenly hits, and it makes it impossible to follow the route they're wanting to follow. As a matter of fact, when you look at what's taking place there, it says, and running under the shelter of an island called Clauda. In other words, it's driving them off course. They're no longer able to be hugging the shoreline of Crete, and instead they're being driven away from Crete. So kind of trying to imagine yourself in this situation that you've got this place you are trying to get to, and suddenly you've got this storm that is not only preventing you from getting there, it's also driving you away from it in the process. And so it says they secured the skiff, okay? We would call that a lifeboat today. So they've brought it on board so that it's not out there banging in the wind, okay? For a couple of reasons. You don't want to lose your lifeboat in pieces into the ocean. And at the same time, when you've got this storm going on, you don't want it out there beating against the hull of the ship, damaging the hull as well. And so they brought it on board and secured it. And then they've used the cables, which were typically just very heavy ropes, to undergird the ship. Anybody know what that means? Yeah, what they would do is they would basically get out on the farthest point they could so that they could loop it under, and they would actually drag it back underneath the ship, bring it up, and begin to tie it off and use like a tourniquet process to tighten it so that the ship was held together. And they would use multiple ropes across the length of the ship to keep it from coming apart. And that's what it's referred to as undergirding the ship to help keep it together so that it doesn't fall apart. And then it says that they struck sail. In other words, this wind is so destructive, you bring the sails down. Why? Because it's driving you off course, and also because you don't want the sails breaking off the masts. And so in order to try and keep this ship intact, they are basically setting themselves up to be just sitting in the water, totally dependent on wherever the wind wants to take them. They are doing nothing at this point, to try and affect any direction in which it's going. They are simply just trying to keep the thing together. That is their main focus. They're trying to keep it afloat, even to the extent that they begin throwing things overboard. What did the Apostle Paul say would happen? You would start losing cargo. You would start losing things. What are they having to do? They are throwing things over, trying to get the ship lighter so that when the waves hit the ship, it's not like hitting a brick wall. Because if the ship is sitting low in the water and the waves hit it hard and it's not moving, something's got to give. And so that constant pounding on the ship, when it's heavy and deeper into the water, is going to have more of a destructive force than if it's sitting a little bit higher. Now, we have a tendency to look at that and think, well, I would think sitting low in the water would be better. Well, one of the reasons we would have a tendency to think that way is we're familiar with metal ships, not the old wooden ships. And they are affected by the waves much different than the modern day ships are. And so the goal was to get it light so that when the waves would come, rather than slamming against it, they would simply lift it up and then set it back down. Of course, that too is dangerous as well, because in the process of being lifted up and set back down, if the wave hits you at the right angle, as it lifts you up, it tips you over. So they are in a situation where they're trying to get this ship into the condition of least likely to be sunk. Okay? And it's one of those situations as this storm is going on, you can almost imagine what's going through their minds. This is bad enough. Probably no matter what we're going to do, we're probably going to go down, but let's see if we can prevent it somehow. Okay? That is the power of this storm that they are facing. One that in many ways, as we're going to see as we go through this passage, leaves them very much in despair. Because as this storm does not let up, as it continues to maintain strength, basically what is going through their mind is it's hopeless. We are not getting out of this alive. No possible way, no how. Any thoughts, comments before we move along? Okay, so let's pick up at verse 20. Now when neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small tempest beat on us, all hope that we would be saved was finally given up. But after long abstinence from food, then Paul stood in the midst of them and said, Men, you should have listened to me, and not have sailed from Crete and incurred this disaster and loss. And now I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For there stood by me this night an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve, saying, Do not be afraid, Paul. You must be brought before Caesar. And indeed, God has granted you all those who sail with you. Therefore, take heart, men, for I believe God that it will be just as it was told me. However, we must run aground on a certain island. So let's pause there for a moment. So now we've got it. They've lost heart. They've given up hope. And trying to imagine the description here, where it says neither sun nor stars appeared for many days. Okay, if you understand the context of what I've been saying, we might go outside and say, I don't see the sun because of the clouds. Okay, the idea of this storm that they are talking about here is one such that during the daytime it would look like it's just about sunset. Very dark, even during the day. So that you have absolutely no sense of direction in any way, shape, or form. And they have reached the point where they are in such fear, they're not even eating. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you were so upset, so afraid of something, or something's going on that had you so upset in some other way that you just lost your appetite? Yeah. That's the type of situation they're in. They are so afraid that they don't even have an appetite anymore. They're not hungry. They're not eating. And then you got Paul. Every now and then you have to kind of realize that occasionally in the Bible there is a little bit of humor. And so Paul gets up and basically says, told you so. That's really what it is. It's an I told you so. Told you so. Okay? But notice the change in what he has to say. When he initially told him, you do not want to make this trip because I think there's going to be loss of cargo and what else? Life. Now he's telling him, yes, the God whom I serve has given your lives to me. And basically what he's saying is what that means is, yeah, you're going to lose the ship and the cargo, but you're all going to live. You're going to survive. We're going to have to run aground. Ship's going to be destroyed. But you are going to survive. You are going to live. So, you've got the flip side of this thing. You've got Paul getting up and he says, I told you so, but take heart. You're going to be okay. And we find that even at this point, even with the Apostle Paul saying, you're going to live, as we begin to get into things, we're going to find out they're still not eating. All right, they're still upset. So basically what you probably have is they don't believe him. All right. It's like, yeah, how can we possibly lose the ship but no one die? How can we possibly lose everything but everyone survives? How can that possibly happen, Paul? That's probably what's going through their minds. As a matter of fact, it doesn't record it, but it wouldn't surprise me. But what maybe they're even asking, how can that be? You're going to lose everything, run aground, going to be destroyed, and yet none of us are going to die. Come on. You can almost see one guy raise his hand. Well, what about me? I can't swim. Paul says, you're all going to live because the God I serve has promised me you would live. And he says, I believe him. In other words, Paul is actually, in a way, giving a mini testimony because what this is coming from is from Paul's background. The idea of what we talked about before. God's kept his promises before. He'll keep his promises still. He's always kept his promises to Paul. And so in this situation, Paul says, I believe him. And I'm sure that Paul said it with an air of confidence that should have got their attention. I mean, try and imagine, you're in this frightening situation. It looks like all is lost. You are sure you're about to die. And somebody gets up with absolute confidence. He says, you're going to be okay. Imagine the contrast of what's going on. You're so afraid you're shaking. You're so afraid you can't eat. You're so sure you're about to die. And someone stands up with absolute, total confidence and says, you're going to be okay. How do I know? Because the God I serve said you were going to be okay. And I believe him. And I think Paul not only said it in a voice of assurance, but a voice of calm. Have you ever been in those situations where someone is able to just simply, with a voice of calm, change the atmosphere? They don't have to yell. They don't have to sound hyper excited or anything to get your attention. They just, in a very calm voice, it's going to be okay. And somehow, it makes a difference. So I think that's what we see in the Apostle Paul. He's not yelling, he's not shouting, but in a voice of calm assurance, you're going to be okay. Now don't get me wrong, I think he does have to speak a little bit loud to be heard over the storm. All right? You do have that going on, but it's one just simply so he can be heard. But it is a voice of confidence and assurance. You're going to be okay. But yet the uncertainty is still there, as we're going to see in a little bit. The uncertainty is still there. But at least the Apostle Paul is taking the opportunity to begin to give them some assurance, to help them begin to not be quite as afraid as they were, to give them a glimmer of hope. I mean, think what it must have been like to be in what's considered to be a hopeless situation, and then to suddenly receive at least a sliver of hope to grasp hold of. Have you ever found yourself in that type of situation? Just a slightest glimmer of hope, and you grasp hold of it. And you hang on to it. And that's what the Apostle Paul has given them. That hope. Any thoughts? Comments? Okay. We'll pick up at verse 27. Now when the 14th night had come, as we were driven up and down in the middle of the Adriatic Sea, about midnight the sailors sensed that they were drawing near some land. And they took soundings and found it to be 20 fathoms. And when they had gone a little further, they took soundings again and found it to be 15 fathoms. Then, fearing lest we should run aground on the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for the day to come. As the sailors were seeking to escape from the ship, when they let down the skiff into the sea, under pretense of putting out anchors from the prow, Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, "Unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved." Then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the skiff and let it fall off. All right. So we'll stop there for now. Okay, so this has been going on for 14 days. Think about that. This storm has been raging for 14 days, nonstop. And notice it says, as we were driven up and down the Adriatic Sea, better known as the Mediterranean Sea. Okay? Basically, they've got no idea where they're at. All they know is they are being driven around everywhere because, remember, this storm is such that it's like during the day it's like the sun is setting, then at night it's just absolutely black. There's nothing to be seen. You can't tell where you're at. All you know is you're being driven wherever the wind blows you, wherever the sea happens to carry you. You're going and you've got no clue where it is. You are lost. And you have no way of figuring out how to get where you want to be. Because you're used to navigating by the sun by day and by the stars at night. And you can't see either one. You can't even tell where the sun is rising and where the sun is setting. Think about that. That's the description that he's given here. That they can't tell where they're at. They can't tell what direction they're going. And it's been going on for 14 days. And now it says, about midnight, the sailors sensed that they were drawing near some land. How would they know that? Change in the sound of the waves. As it gets shallower, the pitch of the waves changes. And you would be able to hear the storm crashing on the seashore in the distance. So you know there's land somewhere. Where, you don't know. But you can hear it. You can tell it is there somewhere. And if you do not know where it's at and you've got no control over the ship, you want to do everything you can to make sure you don't end up running into that land unexpectedly. And so they begin to drop the anchors down in order to stop the ship from moving, or at least slow it down as much as possible. I mean, in some ways this is good, and in other ways it's bad. Because if this storm is of the great enough force, what can happen if you've got anchors gripping hold of things on the bottom of the sea that will not let go, and you've got a storm battering this ship above? Yeah, it'll still tear it apart. Yeah, it'll start ripping its way through. And what will have a tendency to happen is you'll also have some the anchors from front and back, and it's starting to try to rock. It could split the ship. And so you're kind of caught between a rock and a hard place. You want to slow the ship down. You want to stop it from moving, but at the same time, the one thing you can do to stop that can also destroy the ship. And the sailors apparently have reached the point that they're pretty much coming to the conclusion, this ship's getting ready to come apart. Let's get out of here. And so they try to sneak away. But Paul sees what's going on, and he lets the centurion know and tells him they have got to stay or no one will survive. And so what we have is another contrast. The sailors don't believe Paul. Paul said you're going to be okay. The sailor says, no, we're not. Let's get in the skiff and let's get out of here. The centurion believes Paul, and he says, get yourselves back in here now. And so we've got that contrast. At this point, Paul has now built enough rapport with the centurion and the soldiers that they are now believing him over the sailors. That's a big change. I mean, when you really think about it, that is a big change. Because if they did not believe Paul, like the sailors didn't believe Paul, what would they do? Think about this for a minute. Roman soldiers, what would they probably do if they're expecting this ship to be destroyed and everybody on the ship dying? We'll take the skiff. They're not worried about losing their prisoners because they know they're going to die when the ship comes apart. But they believe Paul. And the reaction is not to just tell them, get yourselves back in here. They remove any possibility of escaping the ship by cutting the ropes for lowering the skiff down into the sea and letting it just get carried away. There's now no way off the ship. The anchors have been lowered. And now all they can do is wait and see what happens with this storm as they begin to weather the night. Any thoughts or comments? Okay. Verse 33. And as day was about to dawn, Paul implored them all to take food, saying, today is the 14th day you have waited and continued without food and eating nothing. Therefore I urge you to take nourishment, for this is for your survival, since not a hair will fall from the head of any of you. And when he had said these things, he took bread and gave thanks to God in the presence of them all. And when he had broken it, he began to eat. Then they were all encouraged and also took food themselves. And in all, we were 276 persons on the ship. So when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship and threw out the wheat into the sea. And so we will stop there for now, for the moment. So, it's starting to lighten up just a little bit. It's still going to be dark. It's still going to look like sunset for the most part all day. They're still not eating. Imagine, 14 days no food. I mean, I'm kind of wondering how they managed to have any strength at all over that period of time. They've probably at least been drinking, okay? Because you can go quite a while without food, but you cannot without water, okay? And there could be they've just had little snacks here and there, but not really enough to nourish them. And so he tells them, you've got to eat. You're going to need your strength. You're all going to live. You're not even going to lose a hair off your head. You're all going to live. It's going to be okay. You are going to get through this. But you've got to eat. You've got to get your strength up. And so he takes bread and he gives thanks, breaks it, and begins to eat. It says, then they were all encouraged. As he sets the example, he's eating without fear. He's not afraid. He knows it's going to be okay. And by eating in front of them, he is encouraging them, and they are encouraged, and they too also begin to eat and begin to get their strength back and begin to prepare. And look how many people are on this ship. 276 people on the ship. That's a lot of people for one of these old ships. And the whole atmosphere is beginning to change because you're beginning to see them trust what Paul is saying. You're beginning to see that little glimmer of hope grow as now they are all beginning to eat. They're all preparing for what they're going to have to do. And then, so when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship and threw out the wheat into the sea. The last of the cargo. If you think about it, this is an act of faith, an act of trust. Why do I say that? You've thrown out the last of your food. You're basically saying, I believe we're about to get out of this. We don't need this anymore. And so to lighten the ship, you get rid of it. And you prepare for what's going to come. And keep in mind, this wheat probably was relatively heavy. All right? Because I don't know if you've ever picked up bags of wheat grain or not. More than likely you have, horse feed and things like that. They're not light. And a cargo ship would have probably had several hundred, if not several thousand bags. Because this is part of their cargo. They are taking grain to Rome. And you throw it overboard. And you get the ship as light as possible. And you prepare. What do you prepare for? Whatever Paul tells you to do. He's been right so far. The sailors have been wrong. Whatever Paul says to do, we do it. And we see that switch started to take place when the centurions and the soldiers cut the skiffs loose to go into the sea and made the sailors stay on board. Trust has changed. And they are now preparing for what I believe they already know is going to be the last day they're going to be on that ship. I think the way this is all taking place, the way Paul has been addressing the situation, and the way he has broken the bread and blessed it and began to eat himself and gotten them eating, I think he's sending that signal. It's all about to be over with. You're going to be okay. Everyone's going to live. You're not even going to lose a hair off your head. Let's get ready for this. Let's eat. And I think there is a sense of calm finally coming over everyone on that ship. I mean, you can imagine how terrified everyone who was on there as, how shall I say, passengers, not crew, must have been when the crew is trying to abandon ship and leave them behind. I mean, think about the strong signal that sends. But I think now a calm assurance is now finally settling in for everybody as they are preparing for what is about to happen. Any thoughts, comments before we continue? Okay. Let's finish out the chapter. Verse 39. When it was day, they did not recognize the land, but they observed a bay with a beach, onto which they planned to run the ship if possible. And they let go the anchors and left them in the sea. Meanwhile, loosing the rudder ropes, they hoisted the mainsail to the wind and made for shore. But striking a place where two seas met, they ran the ship aground, and the prow stuck fast and remained immovable. But the stern was being broken up by the violence of the waves. And the soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners, lest any of them should swim away and escape. But the centurion, wanting to save Paul, kept them from their purpose, and commanded that those who could swim should jump overboard first and get to land, and the rest, some on boards and some on parts of the ship. And so it was that they all escaped safely to land. Okay. So it's the day is dawned, and they are now close enough they can see the land, but they don't know where they're at. Doesn't look familiar. That they've been driven off the normal course, off the normal route. They are now someplace they've never been before, and they can see a bay with a beach. In other words, they see a place that looks favorable for getting the ship into, if at all possible. And so it says they let go the anchors. They didn't hoist the anchors. They let go the anchors. Why? You don't want to bring that weight back on board. Okay? And it says they loosed the rudder ropes. What they would typically do is, in these storms, they would tie the rudder in place so it wouldn't get destroyed too and get ripped off. So they've loosened it so they can steer it a little bit. They hoisted the mainsail. Probably did have multiple sails. It's not like we tend to see a classic sailing ship today, what we think of it having all the sails and masts and everything. These typically only had one or two sails on them at all. And they only hoist one of them, so they're trying to maintain as much control as they can and not move overly fast. But they don't get all the way in because it gets shallow faster than they expected as they get to where the bay meets the sea. They were probably moving along at a pretty good speed, because it says when they ran aground, it got stuck. All right? And it is stuck so fast that even though the storm is still working at the ship, it can't work it loose. It is so tight that what's going to happen is it's going to rip the back off the ship. That's stuck pretty tight. They must have hit that sandbar pretty doggone hard. All of a sudden, the soldiers go into panic. Oh, we're going to lose all of our prisoners, and we need to kill them so we don't end up being killed. But it says we see that the centurion is still favorable to Paul, and I believe that also includes still believing what Paul had to say. And so he tells them, no, here's what's going to happen. All of you who can swim, hurry up and jump overboard now. Head for land. Those of you who, I can't swim, what am I going to do? You grab a board. You jump in, get hold of a board, whatever you can get hold of that's floating, you grab hold of it. And then it says, and so it was that they all escaped safely to land. You need to understand something here. Something abnormal is happening with this storm. You are outside of the bay. You're stuck in the sandbar. And the pieces of wood are floating. And where do they just happen to get blown to? They get blown into land. Normally, they'd be scattered all over the place and would not be blown toward land necessarily. you would have some of it being blown back out to sea. But all of those who were able to, well, not able, but all of those who had to grab hold of some wood and something, whatever was floating, in order to keep from drowning, all of those pieces were driven to shore so that everyone was saved. And so in the midst of this storm, which under normal circumstances would have seen all these pieces of the ship blown everywhere and not back into shore, you see just the opposite happening as God fulfills his promise to the Apostle Paul and ensures that everyone on board the ship is safe. It must have been quite an experience for the centurion and the soldiers to start counting heads. You can kind of imagine them coming up to the centurion and says, "They're all here." And I imagine that good possibility that's what happened. They're probably amazed. They're all here. Everyone is here. All of the prisoners are here. All the crew members are here. All the soldiers are here. Everybody's here. We didn't lose anyone. And I can almost imagine Paul off to the side thinking to himself, because my God can do anything. And when he says he's going to spare you, he means it. I mean, this is one of those types of things that if it happened to you, talk about a testimony to share when you're talking to someone about how God keeps his promises. Let me tell you about the time we were sailing to Rome. And everybody was sure we were about to die, and the angel of God told me everybody's going to live. And sure enough, when the ship came apart in a situation where people should have died, no one died. Everyone was safe. That's the God I serve. And that's the God we serve today, too. Still just as powerful. Still keeps his promises. And those that are still yet to come will be kept. But I think that's another thing that we have seen over and over throughout the book of Acts is God keeping his promises to his faithful. God at work, intervening when necessary to ensure the spread of the gospel. Any thoughts, comments before we end for the day? Mm-hmm.
And then one day we headed to one specific place because there was no seatbelt and we knew there. But the wind came out and said, no, we're not going there. We're getting back in. So indirectly you put your trust in him.
Mm-hmm.
So indirectly you put your trust in Paul, knowing that God had Paul's back.
Yeah. 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 And that's just one of those examples that, he knew that under these circumstances, we're not getting to shore. We got to take a different avenue. And that's exactly what made this so incredibly miraculous. It was those kinds of circumstances that nobody should have made it to shore. But they did. All of them. Yeah, another I told you so. But at the same time, everybody probably looking at him and saying, I'm glad you were right. Yeah. Anything else? Okay. And we will pick up with chapter 28 next week.